"Then let them laugh at me," Alexander Whitmore said, his voice cold but laced with something brittle beneath the bravado. "I'd sooner dance with the janitor than with any of you." Gasps burst like fireworks across the ballroom. Laughter followed, sharp, glittering, cruel. Champagne glasses clinked in amusement, and satin-gowned women hid smirks behind jeweled fans. The chandelier's light poured down on Alexander as though he were a king on his throne. But in that instant, the brilliance only magnified the shadow he had just cast over someone else. Because standing in the doorway, framed by golden doors and startled silence, was Naomi Carter. Her mop bucket squeaked against the marble as if announcing her humiliation. She froze. Her uniform, a gray jumpsuit, bore faint traces of bleach and dust. Her dark curls were pinned into a bun that had loosened with the long night's work. Her eyes, deep, unflinching brown, shifted between the mocking faces before locking on Alexander himself. For one long, excruciating second, neither of them moved. The crowd roared with laughter. "Oh, perfect," a man in a velvet blazer called. "Bring her over, Alex. Show us that common folk can waltz." Another woman, lips painted ruby red, sneered, "Careful, darling. You'll get her mop water on your shoes." Naomi's grip tightened on the mop handle until her knuckles whitened. She had cleaned this ballroom before 100 of their events, scrubbing away their spills and sweeping up their confetti. She knew she was invisible to them, useful only when bending low, unseen, but never had she been dragged into their theater of cruelty so directly. Alexander, standing in his tailored midnight suit, adjusted his cufflinks, pretending calm, but his pale blue eyes betrayed a flicker of something, a realization perhaps that his attempt to mock the women pursuing him had just wounded someone else entirely. He had meant to lash out at the shallow socialites circling him, not at the janitor who had nothing to do with their games. And yet here she was, reduced to their entertainment because of his words. Naomi did not flinch. She didn't offer them the brokenness they wanted. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, gave the mop a deliberate push forward, and crossed the room toward the far wall. Her steps echoed with dignity, not defeat. She did not look at Alexander again. She refused to grant him the satisfaction. The laughter grew thinner. Some of the guests seemed disappointed by her composure. They had expected tears, or shame, or flight. Instead, Naomi moved with such quiet strength that their amusement began to curdle into discomfort. But Alexander's chest tightened. The ice he usually carried in his veins felt like shards pressing inward. He raised a glass of champagne to his lips to mask his disquiet, but the bubbles fizzed bitter on his tongue. At the edge of the ballroom, Naomi knelt to wipe a spill of wine left by careless hands. Guests stepped around her, barely noticing. She moved as if she were transparent, her body bending with practiced efficiency. But inside, her thoughts burned. Do they think I can't hear them? That I don't feel the sting of every word? That I am less than them because my hands are rough with work instead of soft with diamonds? Alexander's gaze kept pulling back to her. Something about the way she carried herself, even in uniform, even on her knees with a rag, made the silks and tuxedos around her look gaudy, hollow. For the first time that evening, the billionaire who refused to dance felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath the marble had shifted. "Alexander, darling," cooed Miranda Holloway, the heiress clinging to his arm earlier. "Don't scowl like that. It was just a joke." His jaw clenched. A joke, he thought. That. Word had followed him all his life. Snide remarks in private schools, cutting banter in his father's boardrooms. Except this time, the joke wasn't at his expense. It was on someone who hadn't asked to play. Naomi rose and wrung out the cloth, her posture unbroken. She refused to vanish, refused to give them the collapse they craved. Her strength unsettled Alexander more than her humiliation. And in that gilded hall filled with laughter, champagne, and strings of the orchestra, he realized something. For the first time in years, he was the one being watched, not with admiration, but with quiet judgment from the only pair of eyes in the room that didn't need him. Naomi didn't look back, not once, as she crossed the polished floor. But Alexander couldn't stop looking at her. The music had swelled again, violins pulling the crowd back into waltz tempo, but for him, the room had gone strangely quiet. His reputation was ironclad. Everyone knew Alexander Whitmore did not dance, not for queens of industry, not for actresses flown in from Paris, not even for the governor's daughter. His father had once sneered that dancing was a waste of time better spent on mergers. And since then, Alexander had carried that command like an inheritance. To the glittering elite, his refusal only deepened the mystery around him. But tonight, as Naomi's gray uniform blended against the marble, the cruelty of his defense mechanism had turned on someone undeserving. At the far corner, Naomi bent to pick up shards of a broken champagne flute. Her long fingers moved carefully, one piece at a time, though her eyes flicked up only once, to catch a group of women openly mocking her. "She must think she's auditioning," one whispered. "Imagine him actually touching her hand," another snickered. "The poor girl would faint from the smell of Chanel." Naomi's lips pressed tight, her jaw stiff. She kept working. Inside, the sting of their laughter cut deeper than she'd admit. Her late mother's words hummed faintly in memory. "Hold your chin high, Naomi, dignity iron, since something they can scrub away from you." Tonight, those words became her shield. Alexander turned to Miranda, whose jeweled hand still rested possessively on his arm. "Enough," he said, low but sharp. Miranda blinked. "Enough what, darling?" "The jokes, they aren't clever." His tone was clipped, his gaze elsewhere. Miranda gave a tinkling laugh and leaned closer. "Oh, Alex, you can't be serious. She's staff. It's what they're here for, quiet work and thick skin. If they cared about snide remarks, they wouldn't mop floors." The words landed like a slap, though Alexander wasn't sure why they burned so hot. He pulled his arm free. Miranda's pout followed him as he walked toward the balcony doors, needing air. Naomi noticed. Not him exactly, but the space he left behind. The crowd parted, eyes trailing after him, murmuring about his temper. She shook her head faintly, half pitying, half exasperated. Men like him always stormed away when things didn't bend to their liking. But Alexander didn't reach the balcony. His steps faltered halfway across the floor, drawn instead toward Naomi's corner like a needle to a magnet. She was wiping down a section of the wall, her back straight, her movements calm. He hesitated only a moment before speaking. "You shouldn't have been dragged into that." Naomi's rags stilled. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze with the same steady strength as before. "You said it," she replied softly. "Not them." The words landed heavier than champagne glasses shattering. Alexander's mouth opened, then shut again. He had no defense. Naomi resumed wiping, dismissing him with the deliberate motion. "Don't worry. I've heard worse in quieter rooms." That pierced deeper. Alexander studied her. The curve of her cheekbones catching golden light, the way her eyes didn't dart or shrink. She didn't plead, didn't grovel. She was simply telling the truth, as if she owed him nothing. From across the room, Miranda hissed to a cluster of friends, pointing at the sight of Alexander speaking to the janitor. A ripple of scandalous laughter spread, but Alexander ignored it. "Tell me your name," he said, more urgent than he meant. Naomi blinked at him. "Why? So you can use it in your next punchline?" He flinched. That wall of arrogance he usually hid behind suddenly felt paper thin. For once, words failed him. Naomi wrung out the rag, set it carefully in the bucket, and straightened her back to full height. She wasn't tall, but her poise made her seem unshakable. "It's Naomi," she said at last, each syllable deliberate. Alexander nodded, something unreadable flickering in his pale eyes. "Naomi," he repeated quietly, as though tasting the weight of it. Before she could respond, a burst of laughter erupted nearby. A drunken guest had spilled wine across the marble. "Janitor!" someone called, wagging a glass. "Your services are needed." The laughter that followed was ugly, jagged. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she forced herself forward. She took a deep breath, pushed her bucket across the ballroom, and kneeled to clean the red stain spreading like a wound across the floor. Guests circled around, sipping champagne, some openly amused at the sight of her bent low while their shoes sparkled inches away. Alexander watched, chest knotted. The echo of his father's voice thundered in memory. "Power is about distance, Alexander. Never lower yourself, never bend." And yet here he stood, feeling like the one who was small, watching Naomi kneel in the center of their ridicule with more grace than anyone else in the room. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and chatter, but for Naomi, the sound was all the same, mocking ripples riding over the strings of the orchestra. She scrubbed the wine spill until the crimson blot vanished into the marble's polished veins. Her movements were practiced, steady, but her pulse betrayed her calm facade. Every laugh, every careless glance pressed against her chest like a weight she had carried all her life. "Careful, darling," a guest sneered above her, stepping deliberately close enough for his shoe to splash against the mop water. "Wouldn't want you slipping and suing us." More laughter. Naomi ignored it. She dipped the rag again, refusing to look up. But Alexander saw. He stood stiff near the edge of the crowd, fists tightening at his sides. Their laughter had always been easy for him to tolerate when directed at shallow social rivals. Tonight it burned differently. It wasn't a game, and Naomi wasn't playing. He thought of the look she had given him earlier, her eyes steady as she reminded him he had spoken the words that started all this. "You said it, not them." Shame crawled across his skin, foreign and heavy. The orchestra struck up a new waltz, violins sweeping like a tide. Couples drifted to the floor, skirts swishing, tuxedos gleaming. Naomi remained kneeling at the center, invisible and yet painfully visible, a figure they could mock but never acknowledge. A woman brushed past her with a scoff. "They really should keep the staff out of sight during events. It ruins the photographs." Naomi's hand froze on the mop handle. For the first time her eyes flickered upward, straight at the woman, then around the circle of faces. Her expression was quiet, but her gaze was iron. She did not speak. She didn't have to. That look alone said, "I see you. I hear you. And I am not ashamed." The woman faltered under the weight of it, then sniffed and turned away. Alexander felt his breath catch. There it was again, that strange force in Naomi. She bent under no one's weight, even while on her knees. The realization unsettled him in ways he didn't want to examine. He took a step toward her. Miranda intercepted, seizing his arm with painted nails. "Alexander, don't humiliate yourself further. People are staring." He tore his gaze from Naomi to Miranda's hardened eyes. "And what exactly am I doing to humiliate myself?" "Speaking to her," Miranda hissed, lowering her voice. "Watching her, giving her dignity she hasn't earned." The cruelty was so casual it hollowed him. He pulled his arm free. "You're wrong," he muttered, but his voice cracked, and Miranda's laugh rang like breaking glass. Naomi stood, wringing out the mop cloth one last time. She pushed the bucket aside and dusted her palms together. Her shift was nearly done. She had survived worse nights than this. Yet tonight felt different, sharper, because she had been shoved into the spotlight, because her dignity had been a spectacle for others. Her father's voice echoed faintly in memory. "You are not the work you do, Naomi. You are the way you carry it." So she carried herself tall, even in her bleach-stained uniform. She would not shrink for them. But Alexander could not look away. The crowd swirled with music and perfume, yet all he saw was Naomi, standing quietly alone, more commanding than any heiress in her silk gown. For the first time in his carefully orchestrated life, he felt something slipping loose, an urge he didn't understand, a defiance against the rules carved into him by his father's voice, by society's expectations. And when Naomi's eyes brushed his once more across the glittering room, a decision crystallized in him. He would no longer let her stand there as their joke. He would shatter the game. The violins soared, couples spun, and the Whitmore ballroom glowed with golden light. Yet all of it blurred in Alexander's vision. His chest thudded with something unfamiliar, fear maybe, but also conviction. Naomi was moving toward the service door, her mop bucket trailing quietly behind her. She had endured enough of their sneers. She wanted nothing more than to finish her shift and disappear from this poisonous room. But Alexander stepped forward. "Naomi?" His voice carried across the orchestra's swell. The crowd froze. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. 100 jeweled faces turned toward the billionaire who never danced, never raised his voice, never acknowledged anyone beneath his station. Naomi halted, shoulders stiffening. She turned slowly. "Yes?" For a moment he faltered. The eyes on him were suffocating, but Naomi's gaze steadied him, quiet and unyielding. He took another step, then another, until he stood in front of her. He extended his hand. The ballroom gasped. Glasses clinked against marble as someone dropped a drink. The orchestra, sensing drama, faltered to a ragged halt. Silence crashed in. "Dance with me," Alexander said. Naomi blinked, stunned. Her lips parted in disbelief, then pressed into a line. "This isn't funny." "It's not a joke," Alexander replied, his voice trembling but firm. "Not anymore." The silence was electric. Whispers hissed through the crowd. Has he lost his mind? With her? In that uniform? This will ruin him. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. Every humiliation from the night rose up inside her. Every cruel laugh, every mocking glance, every reminder she didn't belong here. And now this? To be dragged back into their spotlight again? Her eyes darted to Alexander's, searching for mockery. But what she found there stopped her breath. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't amused. He looked raw, exposed. His pale eyes were stripped of arrogance, carrying something far heavier. Shame, yes, but also a desperate sincerity. "I was wrong," he said softly, only for her but loud enough to echo in the silence. "I put you in their crosshairs. I hurt you. And I'm asking, please, let me undo it." Naomi's throat tightened. Her instinct screamed to walk away, to protect herself from another round of cruelty. But another part of her, the part that had carried dignity through mop water and broken glass, hesitated. The crowd leaned forward, hungry. Finally, Naomi drew a slow breath. She set her mop handle gently against the wall. Then, with a steady hand that betrayed no fear, she placed her fingers in his. The orchestra, as if holding its breath, found its cue again. The violins returned, soft at first, then swelling. Alexander led Naomi to the center of the floor. The guests parted, forming a shimmering ring. Some were appalled, others fascinated, all silent. He placed his hand lightly at her waist, the other enclosing hers. For the first time in his life, Alexander's arrogance slipped away. His steps were imperfect, clumsy even, but he moved carefully, reverently, as though the floor itself were sacred because she was on it. Naomi held her chin high. Every gaze burned against her, but she refused to cower. Instead, she looked into Alexander's eyes, searching, questioning. He held her gaze with unflinching honesty, and then, softly, he whispered, "I'm sorry." The words cracked in his throat. No one else could hear them, but Naomi did. And for the first time that night, something inside her softened. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition that this man was no longer playing games. The ballroom had never been so quiet. Two figures turned slowly under crystal chandeliers. The billionaire who had sworn no one was worthy, and the janitor who carried herself with unshakable dignity. In that silence, something shifted, not just between them, but in every person watching. The silence fractured into whispers. They rippled across the ballroom like cracks in ice. Is this real? He's humiliating himself. With her? My God, what is he thinking? Alexander heard every word, but for the first time in his life, he didn't care. His hand trembled slightly at Naomi's waist, not from nerves about the dance, but from the sheer weight of what it meant to hold her there, in front of everyone. Naomi felt the tremor too. She had expected arrogance, a cruel joke, some twist to turn her into the punchline. Again. Instead, she found something she never imagined in him, fragility. His eyes no longer gleamed with ice, but with an ache that mirrored her own. The music swelled, violins climbing. Naomi let her steps follow his lead, hesitant at first, then surer. She had never waltzed, not properly, but her instincts carried her. The crowd's murmurs pressed in, but she refused to look at them. Her gaze stayed locked on Alexander's, steady and defiant. A woman near the front let out a sharp laugh. "This is absurd! Alexander, darling, stop this nonsense before you embarrass yourself further." Alexander's steps faltered for half a beat. His jaw tightened. Naomi felt the conflict in him, the old Alexander, the one raised on pride and cold distance, straining to pull away. But then he drew her closer, his voice low and fierce against her ear. "Let them choke on their own laughter." Naomi's breath caught. She hadn't expected defiance, not for her. The crowd's whispers swelled into arguments. Some were scandalized, others curious. A few silently thrilled to see Alexander break his untouchable facade. A group of young men chuckled bitterly at the sight, while older women shook their heads in disdain. Miranda's voice cut through it all. "Enough!" she snapped, stepping into the circle, her ruby gown blazing under the chandeliers. Her eyes blazed with fury. Alexander Whitmore, this stunt is beneath you. She is beneath you. Gasps rippled. All eyes snapped to Naomi. Naomi stiffened, every nerve alight with shame and fury. But before she could speak, Alexander stopped in the middle of the floor. He released Naomi's hand and turned to Miranda, his face pale but burning with something the crowd had never seen in him, anger on behalf of someone else. "You're wrong," he said, voice echoing against marble. Miranda's laugh was cold. "Wrong? Look at her, Alex. Look at what you've done. Dragged a cleaning girl into a place she doesn't belong. You're ruining everything your father built with this charade." Alexander's breath hitched at the mention of his father. The crowd waited, sensing his weakness. Naomi stepped back slightly, prepared to leave him to his choice, either fold under their pressure or abandon her to save his pride. She wouldn't beg for his defense. She had lived long enough knowing no one would fight her battles but herself. But Alexander turned, slowly, and faced the circle of glittering, judgmental faces. His hand shook as he spoke. "She belongs here more than any of you." The room froze. "She walked in carrying your contempt and didn't bend," he continued, voice hoarse but steadying with every word. "I've spent my whole life hiding behind money, refusing to touch anyone because I thought no one was good enough. Tonight I realized," his eyes flicked to Naomi, "I'm the one who wasn't enough. Not for her. Not for any of this." Naomi's breath caught. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, others in shocked applause. The orchestra faltered again, strings squealing under the weight of the chaos. Miranda's face crumpled in fury. And Naomi? She stood silent, watching Alexander finally crack open before the very people who once worshipped him. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Voices clashed like cymbals, some sharp with outrage, others buzzing with scandalous delight. Has he gone mad? He's destroying his reputation. No, don't you see? He's finally human. Naomi stood at the center of it, the epicenter of a storm she never asked to join. Her palms prickled with heat, her breath shallow. She wanted to walk away, to vanish back into the shadows where no one could use her name as a weapon. But her feet refused to move. Alexander stood beside her, pale under the chandeliers, trembling with the weight of his own words. His father's voice roared in his head. Power is distance. Never bend, never bow. For 27 years he had obeyed it. Tonight, he defied it. And then, he bent. Before anyone could stop him, Alexander dropped to one knee on the polished marble, his hand pressed against his chest, his eyes fixed on Naomi. Gasps split the room, glass shattered somewhere in the back, the violin screeched to a halt. "Naomi Carter," he said, his voice cracking but carrying through the stunned silence. "I mocked you. I dragged you into their cruelty to protect myself. And I humiliated you in front of them. I can't undo it, but I can own it. I am sorry. I am so damn sorry." The words spilled raw, stripped of polish. His shoulders shook. His composure, that fortress of control, crumbled under the eyes of everyone who once feared him. Naomi's throat tightened. She had imagined him arrogant, aloof, even cruel, but never this, never kneeling, never pleading. Around them, the crowd whispered furiously. Some scoffed. Pathetic. Others murmured. Courageous. The balance of power had shifted, and no one knew how to handle it. Miranda's voice slashed through. "This is madness. She's a janitor, Alex. You're on your knees for her?" Alexander's gaze didn't leave Naomi's. "For the first time in my life, I'm on my knees for the right person." Naomi's lips parted. Heat flooded her chest, a mixture of shock, anger, and something gentler she wasn't ready to name. She could feel every eye on her, pressing for a reaction. Her pride screamed to walk away, to let him burn in the shame he had created. But another voice whispered, the one that remembered her mother's lessons. "Your worth isn't given, it's already yours." So she straightened her back, stepped forward, and offered him her hand. Not in forgiveness, not yet, but in recognition. The room gasped again. Alexander looked up, eyes wide, before placing his hand in hers. She helped him to his feet, not as a damsel rescued, but as an equal demanding respect. Her voice was clear, steady and sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. "Don't apologize because they're watching. Apologize because you mean it." "I mean it," Alexander said without hesitation, his voice shaking. Naomi studied him for a long beat, searching his eyes for even a trace of deceit. She found none. Finally, she gave a single nod. Then stand and carry it. The orchestra, unsure but sensing the moment, struck a tentative chord. The music swelled again, but the dancing had stopped. The glittering crowd stood frozen, forced to reckon with what they had seen. The untouchable billionaire stripped of his armor, and the janitor he once mocked now holding the room's respect without saying more than a handful of words. The music swelled, but no one moved. The ballroom, once so eager to spin and laugh, now stood paralyzed in the aftermath of Alexander's fall from arrogance. For a moment the chandeliers seemed to dim, their golden light softening as though the room itself were holding its breath. Naomi still held Alexander's hand. She could feel the tremor in his palm, the pulse of a man who had never been vulnerable in front of anyone, now cracked open for all to see. Her chest tightened with a mixture of emotions: vindication, sorrow, disbelief. She let go. Her hand fell back to her side, leaving his empty. Alexander flinched, but he didn't reach for her again. He had learned enough tonight to know that she wasn't something to claim, she was someone to respect. Naomi turned to the crowd, her eyes swept across jeweled gowns and tailored tuxedos, across faces that had laughed at her, sneered at her, treated her dignity like a disposable rag. She didn't need to shout. Her silence alone demanded attention. Finally she spoke. "You mocked me tonight. You mocked the work I do, the uniform I wear. But I walked into this room honest. I don't pretend to be more than I am. Can any of you say the same?" The words landed heavy, slicing through the perfume-thick air. A ripple of discomfort spread. Some shifted too. Wait. Others looked away. Naomi's voice softened, but it carried. "I don't need your approval. I never did. But maybe you needed to see yourselves for what you are." With that, she stepped back, collected her mop bucket, and began walking toward the doors. The crowd parted without a word. Alexander watched her go, his chest aching with a mixture of shame and awe. He wanted to call after her, to beg her to stay, but something in her stride told him this wasn't his choice. This was hers. At the doors, Naomi paused. She turned her head slightly, her profile framed by the chandelier's glow. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the marble like a final verdict. "Thank you for the dance." Then she was gone, swallowed by the cool night air beyond the golden doors. Alexander remained standing at the center of the floor, every eye still on him. But for once, he didn't shrink from the weight of their judgment. His head bowed, his voice barely above a whisper. She was the only one worth dancing with. The orchestra resumed its waltz, hesitant at first, then steady. Guests whispered, gossiped, spun theories they would carry into the tabloids and beyond. But none of them could erase what they had witnessed. A man stripped of pride, a woman who refused to be broken, and the truth of dignity shining brighter than all the chandeliers combined. Hours later, when the ballroom was empty and the music had died, Alexander stood alone at the balcony, staring into the night. Somewhere beyond the city lights, Naomi walked home, her steps quiet but strong. For him, the dance had ended. For her, life went on. And yet, in the silence of his heart, Alexander knew the truth. It was not wealth or power or applause that had changed him tonight. It was the simple, unshakable dignity of a woman in a gray uniform who had carried herself like a queen.